I saw a production here 2 years ago, and I didn't know the play at all. So I went and read the play, and I thought, I thought it was incredible. You know, as you did, if you read that play, you think it's incredible. But I thought, you know, the one we saw here was in monologues, and I thought, I don't think it's meant to be in monologues. And actually, recently I had a conversation with Gordon Bland, you know Gordon. But he said that that note at the start text makes him think that Simon Stevens thinks it's not finished. You know, it needs putting in another order, and I think that's true. I don't think there's, you know, I think it's strange to leave it in the order that it's written when it has that explicit stage direction. It can be performed in any order, and so not to do that seems strange to me. And so I began to I read the play, and I thought, what order would I do this in? And then I listened to, I had to present it for a seminar with Gordon, you know. And I listened to an interview with Simon Stevens, interviewed by Alex Sears for Theatre Voice. And all the things that he was, you know, I listened to it and I thought that this makes sense. This idea of a transgressive society that the bombers effectively became these monsters on screens, and that there was no moment of self-reflection. There was just an immediate kind of blame and culture, and ironically the bombers and the victims were both objectified in the same way. All kind of made sense, and I wanted to interrogate it.
Interesting what you were saying about Simon Stevens thinking it's unfinished. Because I think Simon Stevens has probably said of all, if not most of his plays, he believes in, he's a writer who doesn't believe in the centrality and the deification of the writer, which is really refreshing and as a director I imagine very liberating. Do you think that Simon Stevens would be happy with this production?
Blimey. I mean, what I'd hope for is that he would watch it and admire the I suppose the ambition with which we went about it. Whether or not he kind of agrees that we get it right, you know, I wouldn't say that he would be happy with that. The reaction I would want from Simon Stevens is that he'd look at it, at what we've done, because I don't think you can get it right. I don't think you can get this play. Exactly, that is the beauty of it. And I think
whereas something, for example, like God of Carnage, you probably can get right.
Get right, yeah. But yeah, I'd like him to watch it and say, you had a bloody good crack at getting it right, and I think you did a good job of saying some of the things that I was trying to say.
Sure.
So, and I can't say whether he would have liked it, but I hope so.
Okay, so more about the production itself. Do you think? What were you trying to say about our current society in that show, and the way in which you directed it and designed it?
When I read the play, it occurred to me that there were two, what I called when I was kind of conceiving my own ideas, two spheres of perception. So there's the sphere on stage in which we perceive all of these characters in their day-to-day lives, their domestic realities, and their personal transgressions. And then there's another sphere of perception by which we see the wider picture. And that wider picture is generally conveyed to us through the characters who are never at any of the big events. You know, even the bomber there, that monologue stops just short of the bombing. That is conveyed to us through the characters who see it and hear it on screens, on television, on the internet, and from the radio and from the newspapers. That struck me as typical of the average Briton's experience of 7/7, because actually, although everybody imagines that it's this visceral moment, 99% of people, probably more, experienced it on the other side of a television screen. I thought back to how I did it. I remember I was doing a show at the time, and I was in a school, and there was this television in the corner of the coffee bar, and we were all running around doing the show, and eventually there was this kind of traffic towards the television screen, and eventually we all ended up there and we were just watching it kind of dumbly, you know, wondering how we were meant to react. A la 9/11, yeah, it's one of those moments you know where you are. And then my mum, funny enough, was producing the show, and she came in and she said, yes, it's very sad, but we've all got to get on with it, and we had to get on with it. And I think what I was trying to say was firstly something about the voyeurism of that society. You know, there's something about the obituaries, which obituaries are voyeuristic. You know, and we read obituaries in papers to try and gain some sort of understanding of why it has happened, and to try and gain some sort of personal connection to what has happened, even though because we feel like we ought to. But we don't, you know, we objectify these people by reading their obituaries and reducing them to these obituaries as much as a bomber objectifies them by just seeing them as bodies, as products of a particular culture, as much as people are objectified by pornography. It was that voyeurism, that objectification, and that sense that even in the aftermath of cataclysmic events, life goes on, and we have to have that moment of self-realisation.
Do you think it's universal, both in terms of its time period, so it's been described as a history play, or you know, recently a few of us have realised that it is a history play, and its location. So, for example, my memory of 7/7 was in school, and the news slowly reverberated around school, but some people had parents working in London and so were terrified that something had happened to them. And I wonder whether the more you move out of London, it becomes less and less important, or just does it reach people less and less? You know, what does it have to say to maybe someone in America?
I mean, in terms of somebody from America, I mean, there are sort of obvious resonances, I would say, with 9/11. You know, I think 7/7 is probably regarded as our 9/11 moment, even though it probably didn't change the course of world events quite in the same way. I think that was one of the things I was trying to explore. I mean, you know, when it happened, when we were watching on the other side of the screen, you know, I didn't feel an immediate connection to it. I didn't feel an immediate kind of, you know, sadness or loss or anything really. It was just an image on the other side of the screen. Perhaps that's because I was so far removed, you know.
So well, maybe then the ideal audience is not a London audience.
No, true, but I mean, quite possibly. I mean, but then the thing is, you know, it did have some effect. I mean, when we were doing the show, the director was from London, you know, and we knew people in London, you know, because London is such a hub. I mean, but the thing is, I think in the play, actually, first of all, it doesn't all occur in London, you know, because, I mean, essentially, the bombers don't start in London. You know, it's not just about, you know, that small speck on the map that is, you know, that is London. It is about the wider country. You know, we don't. You know, these people in the play don't all live within a square mile of the bombings. You know, they live on the outskirts of London. In the case of the bomber, that person lives a long way outside London. So it is a play about Britain, and so I think people can relate to it.
Why was it then originally produced in Germany?
Was it too close to home, potentially?
Yeah.
You know, I think you know, it was only, what was it? Was it 2008 or 2007? 2008. And that was, you know, maximum 3 years afterwards. I think that was still fairly untouchable in Britain at the time. And I think although I suspect that people would have wanted to, but I'd say that probably it was easier for it to be produced in Germany, for example, and to see how it went down and what was done with it, and that it could be done.
And it worked as a piece of theatre.
And that it worked as a piece of theatre, yes, and then to bring it back across.
Sure.
I think probably in 2008 it would have, had it been first produced in Britain, it would have blown up a hell of a storm.
I always find it fascinating that the thing which is discussed, or the thing that was discussed when it was first in Britain, in Edinburgh, was not a racist school child or a brother and sister, an incestuous brother and sister, but the bomber. The bomber was still the centre of that thing, and it always becomes about the bomber. I think what sort of your production was that it's not just the bomber. There are other people around or the bombers. By splitting it up, you maybe take away some focus.
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, that was one of the things I wanted to do. I didn't want it to focus on the bomber, because, and we obviously we cut the text up, and two of the main things that we did to remove the focus from the bombers was firstly to have two bombers. First so that we could remove it from this is the image of a bomber. So we had two very different depictions of the bomber, and also one of them who was Northern Irish, which shows that image changes over time. It's just that in this particular moment in time.
Thing about that representation. Was Ema playing a young Middle Eastern man, or was she playing herself?
She was playing. She wasn't playing I suppose she was playing an Irish bomber. They were playing two bombers who were frustrated by this cultural transgression.
Right. Because the interesting thing about those two, in regard with and what's different about those two to the other people, is they're real people. We can call them names. We can find the names of those two people. And I wonder whether because they're real people who you've cast outside of what they would ordinarily look like. So they're not naturalistically played. Then someone like, for example, the old woman, who's played fairly naturalistically.
Although played by a young woman.
Although played by a young woman, but still played as an old woman.
Yes.
Did you ever consider with other parts not playing them as their age, or just playing them as Ema did with the bomber, of just playing it as herself?
I think it's right to play them naturalistically, because I think what Stevens is trying to get away from is this idea that these people are bombers. You can identify them by what they look like, what they sound like. He says that the bombers were British, and that's the important thing about them. So I picked two British people. Right, okay. By happy coincidence, I got a young man who looks fairly Middle Eastern and a young woman with a Northern Irish accent. And that then created a really interesting dynamic. I think with regards to the other people, yes, we could have, I suppose we could have cast them or played them non-naturalistically, but then I think the power of those characters is that, or rather the power of the play is that we can use the script or the order of the script or the way we do the script to create the alienation.
Yeah, sure.
But in order to create an identification initially for the alienation to work, they had to be naturalistic, they had to be identifiable.
I reckon that there's probably also a little bit of a question then which is brought about the fault lines between fact and fiction. There are people in this play that are real, there are people in this play that did exist, there are people in this play that never existed, they're just figments of imagination. And you then really throw that up in the air by having some playing naturalistically and some playing as themselves.
There's also an interesting point. I was talking to Doug, who selected it. We were kind of playing with the obituaries in rehearsal, and his point was that the play does enough to make you think. With these obituaries, if you read them, so the obituaries in the play are taken from The Guardian. They're snippets from The Guardian obituaries, and you read them, and they are portraits of saints, of good people. What the play does implicitly is to suggest that the people that we see before, the characters, could be the people whose obituaries are played. So, for example, when we didn't do this in the original Warwick production, we did it here, was that we had the actors saying some of the obituaries. They said two obituaries, and I deliberately picked one obituary each which could relate to their character. And we tried that, so I brought them to rehearsals and I said, okay, Essay, who was a student, read this obituary for us. And she read an obituary about somebody who went and studied at UCLA for 2 years, like the student says, and then turned down the chance to continue her studies and came back because she missed London. That's effectively what the student says. So I think there is a real blurring of fact and fiction, but I think the point is that yes, the Bombers were who they were and they did what they did for a reason, but they could have been anybody.